Um, Again, so thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this conversation this evening. We hope there'll be lots of questions and an active chat. We welcome you to offer questions in the chat at any point, and we will hold some time at the end to tackle what we can. So we definitely want to make sure this is useful and informative for everyone here. I'm Alexis Lucky with Toxic Free North Carolina. We are a statewide organization based in Durham that has been working for 40 years this year, since 1986, to promote environmental health and justice across North Carolina. We help communities advocate for safer policies, and through programming like this, we share information about protecting our health and the environment from harmful chemicals. This evening's webinar is co-hosted by New Hope Bird Alliance. Barbara, I think if you're here, if you want to come off mute and share a few words about New Hope Bird Alliance.
Driscoll. I'm with New Hope Bird Alliance, their co-chair for conservation. We are the local. We have twice a week bird walks. Please go to our website at newhopebird.org. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. And we are thrilled to welcome Jacqueline Buenstro from Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation here with us this evening. And she's going to chat about mosquitoes, and we'll talk about steps we can take to protect our health, environment, and neighborhoods as the weather warms up and we see increased mosquitoes this season. And with that, I will pass it over to Jacqueline.
Thanks, Alexis, and thank you all so much for hosting me this evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. As Alexis said, my name is Jacqueline Buenstro, and I work with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. And my role is really to help communities around the country reduce their pesticide use and better protect pollinators. And we do this even when dealing with really tricky issues like managing mosquitoes. So to kick us off this evening, I am going to give an overview of mosquitoes and their life cycle, how they live, what risks they can pose to us by spreading disease, and why spraying pesticides is ultimately not the best solution for controlling mosquitoes. And then I will pass it over to the Toxic Free NC team to tell us more about solutions and what we can do to better protect not only ourselves, but our wildlife too. So before I go any further, I would like to introduce you to my organization. So, what is the Xerces Society? Our name comes from the Xerces blue butterfly, which is pictured there on the left side of the slide. And this butterfly was native to the San Francisco coast. Now, unfortunately, this species doesn't have a particularly happy ending, and it's thought to be the first butterfly in North America to go extinct due to human activity. Now, the silver lining with this story is that this butterfly's story and the motivation to protect insects that came from that is what inspired the founding of the Xerces Society over 50 years ago. So fast forward to today, we have around 100 staff scattered across the United States in more than 24 states, and our work is around the main areas of pollinator conservation, endangered species protection, and reducing risks from pesticides. And this work really depends on the generous support of a community of members and donors. This is really such a critical time, I think, to support conservation work and organizations that are doing that work amid funding cuts. So I would just say that whatever cause, whatever organization is important to you, whether that's Xerces, Toxic Free NC, New Hope Bird Alliance, any other organization that's doing work that you appreciate, now is a really important time to support where you can. And these are all of our wonderful, amazing members and donors. So I do want to thank them because without them, we could not do the work that we do. So diving into mosquitoes. So it turns out that mosquitoes are a very diverse group of insects. There are many different kinds, several thousand species of mosquitoes worldwide, and just over 60 species in the state of North Carolina alone. And so some of these species do transmit disease, which we will get to a little bit later on. But I think it's really important to point out that many of these species are not important for disease. The majority of them are not. And many of them do not even bite people. And so as a result, they don't transmit disease to us. So they are going to be biting other animals and pose no risk to us. Another fun fact that I like to mention is that only female mosquitoes bite. And so there's good reason for their biting. They're not just doing it because they are evil, I promise. So female mosquitoes actually need the proteins in blood in order to provide for their eggs so that they can lay those eggs and reproduce. So if they don't bite and get that blood, that means they are not able to reproduce and make mosquito babies. So talking more about the mosquito life cycle. Now, this life cycle is going to be very important for understanding how to control mosquitoes later on. So the adult mosquito, which is what we see buzzing around and biting us, is only one stage in this life cycle. So once she finds some blood, she is going to lay her eggs in standing still water. And she only needs a very small amount of water, about the amount that's in a bottle cap, to lay those eggs. She can lay 100 eggs at a time and multiple times throughout her life. So that can really add up. Those eggs can also stick to the edge of a container. And so even if that water level goes down, those eggs can survive up to 8 months without water. So once they're in that water, those eggs are going to hatch after a few days, and they're going to turn into larvae, which is at the bottom of that circle there. They are going to live in the water, and they are going to feed on microorganisms, little things living in the water. They will then develop into pupa, which are also in the water after about 5 days. That's the last stage of development before they turn into the adult, who then flies off and starts the whole cycle over again. So this cycle can take as little as 8 to 10 days. And with as many eggs as they can produce, that means that mosquitoes can multiply quite fast. So, as annoying as mosquitoes can be, it's important to mention that they are not just pests. They play very important parts in our environment, and our environment would be worse off without mosquitoes in it. So, first, they are great recyclers of nutrients. So, in this picture on the left, there are lots of little larvae in the water, and what's below them is lots of leaves and other decaying plant matter in that water. So the mosquitoes are actually helping us break that stuff down and eating algae and other microbes along the way. Then all of those nutrients that they eat in the water are going to be recycled again when the larvae become food for other wildlife. So they are going to get eaten by other things that live in the water, like fish. And the ones that do end up developing into the flying adults are now going to be food for birds, bats, dragonflies, frogs, and other animals that live on land. And I know that mosquitoes individually are very tiny, and so this might not seem like a big deal. But when we talk about millions of pounds of mosquitoes across the year, this is really an important food source for wildlife. Another neat thing that mosquitoes do is they are pollinators. So remember I said only the females drink blood. Well, the males need energy too. And they are going to get their energy by drinking nectar from flowers, just like a bee or a butterfly would. So they are not as good at pollinating as a bee because bees have all those hairs that are actually made to collect pollen. But mosquitoes do get pollen stuck to them while they're drinking nectar, and they pollinate in the process. And of course, I need to mention that mosquitoes can be vectors of disease that impact humans as well as other animals. So in North Carolina, there are three diseases that can be spread by mosquitoes in the state. And these are West Nile virus, Eastern equine encephalitis, and La Crosse encephalitis. And I do not want to minimize the seriousness of these diseases. Severe illness can and certainly does occur. But for the majority of cases, there are actually no symptoms. So, for example, someone might have West Nile virus and not even know that they are sick because they don't feel sick. You might sometimes hear about a North Carolina resident who has dengue fever or malaria. So these diseases are actually not spread by mosquitoes in a state. Instead, they are going to come from maybe someone has traveled outside the state or outside the country and then realized that they were sick and got bit by a mosquito, outside of North Carolina, didn't realize they were sick until they were back home. And so, of course, we want to take steps to limit the spread of these diseases where we can. And so, whether symptoms are minor or severe, we just don't want people getting sick, right? And so, the good news is that these diseases are preventable and smart management can be used to fight the bite and stop their spread. So, mosquito management is something that is most effective at the community level. What we do in our yards is important, and it takes the whole community working together. And at the community level, oftentimes mosquitoes are managed by a local government organization too. And so locally, that would be the Durham County Department of Public Health. But no matter where you live, you can usually find out who manages mosquitoes in your community with a quick internet search, for example, by looking up Wake County mosquito management or whatever county you live in, mosquito management. But I will say be careful to scroll past all the private companies that are advertising until you get to a real government website. And I do want to briefly talk about what good, effective mosquito control looks like at that community government level. So first, a good program involves investing in public education and communication to make sure that everyone knows what they can do to stay safe and healthy and reduce mosquito bites at home. It should also involve active monitoring of mosquitoes and setting thresholds for management. So, in particular, for disease and for populations of mosquitoes that spread disease. So, remember how I mentioned that many species in the state don't actually spread disease. These mosquitoes might be annoying and we might manage them with non-chemical methods, but they are not what should trigger pesticide use. So instead, pesticide use should only be done when monitoring shows that disease risk is high and when there are populations of the species capable of spreading disease. So prevention is also a key component here because there are lots of things that communities can do to prevent mosquito numbers and disease from actually becoming a threat in the first place. A big one is reducing standing water. This can mean draining ditches on public property and ensuring that there aren't big spaces that are just holding stagnant water where mosquitoes might breed. This also looks like keeping natural waterways healthy. Like we mentioned earlier, there are so many species of fish and other organisms that live in the water that eat mosquito larvae, and they can be very effective at keeping mosquito populations low so that there are very few that actually develop into the flying, biting adults that we are worried about. And when diseases are found at concerning levels and the municipality decides to treat, we encourage ecologically responsible interventions that are of a low toxicity. So, one example that is going to be quite effective, more effective than spraying the adults, is going to be treating standing water. And there are good options, such as bacterium, that are actually very specific to just mosquito larvae and a few related species that won't impact other organisms that we want to protect. So that is actually going to be less toxic and more effective than truck-based fogging can be in the long run. Okay, so now that we've covered the community level, let's talk about residential mosquito sprays. I have really seen these private services gain a lot of traction in the last couple years, and around this time of year in particular, you will see lots of different companies advertising their mosquito control services. And I think often people hear about these services and they hire them really believing that it is the best way to keep your family safe from disease. And we definitely agree that keeping your family safe is the right goal here. But I'm going to spend some time myth busting a lot of the advertising that we see about how these sprays are a safe and effective way to do that, because it turns out they are not. So, as I mentioned, these sprays are applied by private companies. You may hear them called barrier sprays, and they use a large droplet size of insecticide to coat the vegetation around the property. The photo you see here is a barrier spray being applied right along a property line. So that fence is the property line. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like those spray particles are respecting property lines very well. So the most common type of insecticide used are what we call pyrethroids. Don't worry, I won't quiz you on that later. But as a group, these are highly toxic insecticides. They are broad spectrum, which means they kill more than just mosquitoes. So they are going to kill bees and butterflies and all the other beneficial insects that we are trying to protect. So these chemicals, they are related to a natural compound that occurs in chrysanthemum flowers. But I want to be very clear, they are not natural. Pyrethroids are synthetic. They are made by humans in a lab to mimic that natural compound. Because of that history, you will often hear these companies advertise that they use natural chemicals. They're made from flowers. But I want to be very clear, the chemical relative might be made from flowers, but pyrethroids, they are not natural. They are synthetic. They're made in a lab. They are made to be more toxic than the natural compound, and they are made to last longer. So some can last several weeks, and some of them are actually PFAS or forever chemicals, which means they stick around a lot longer than that. So the Xerces Society was really interested in this phenomenon. And we recently did a study that looked more closely at these private residential mosquito sprays. We were really hoping to learn exactly how risky are these sprays for bees and other pollinators, and what about drift? We know that some folks are very sensitive to chemicals. They may have pets that they want to protect, or maybe they have a nice pollinator garden in their yard and they just don't want those chemicals around. So we wanted to know if a neighbor sprays for mosquitoes, is that going to drift into your yard? So we recruited volunteers across 3 different states, including Georgia, Massachusetts, and Iowa. And those participants were people who either hired a spray service or whose neighbors did. And so, right before those sprays happened, we hung monitors in the yard to collect pesticide residues. And then we took those down when the spray was done and sent them to a lab to see what pesticides were there and how much residue there was. And then we used that information to estimate the risk to pollinators. And here are just a few photos of those monitors in the field. So we actually used silicone bands, very similar to the kind that people wear as bracelets. And silicone is actually great for this type of thing because it captures residues from many different types of chemicals. So what did we find? Well, overall, we detected 12 different insecticides and 1 synergist. And a synergist is a separate chemical that can be added to an insecticide to make it more toxic. So overall, this is really a chemical cocktail that's on folks' yards from these sprays. 5 of those 12 were pyrethroids, the chemical that I mentioned earlier. And I'll highlight one specifically. Bifenthrin is one particular pyrethroid that really was the star of the show. It was in just over 3/4 or 76% of our samples. And one of the reasons I highlight this chemical is not only because it was so common, but also because it's a PFAS or a forever chemical. So it's pretty unsettling to think that this is just being sprayed all over people's yards. So what does this translate to as far as risk to pollinators? Looking at the residues that were on the monitors, we did some math to figure out how does that compare to the lethal dose for bees. And what we found was that yards that are directly sprayed by a service had, on average, over 6 times the lethal dose for bees in that yard. So 6.6 times the lethal dose for honeybees. There were also yards that were a lot higher than that. So there were 2 separate yards, one that was 34 times the lethal dose and one that was 24 times the lethal dose. These yards also had, on average, over 4 different pesticides per yard. And I do want to back up a little bit and mention that we did this risk assessment using honeybees as our model because unfortunately, the lethal dose is not something that is known or studied for the majority of native insect species. Although some evidence does show that many native species are actually more sensitive to pesticides than the honeybee. So next, let's look at the neighboring yards. folks who were near a sprayed yard did experience drift or chemical trespass. And unfortunately, this seemed to be the rule, not the exception, because 75% of the monitors in neighboring yards had residues. The amount was much lower than it was in the yards that were directly sprayed, but the highest level was still 2 times the lethal dose for honeybees. So the risk is still there. And these neighboring yards also had an average of just over 1 chemical per yard. So, in summary, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that spraying a yard for mosquitoes carries very high risk to pollinators and other insects. So, the fact that we found 24 and 34 times the honeybee lethal dose in 2 different yards was pretty shocking. And that's just for honeybees. We know that many pollinator species are actually going to be even more sensitive than this. And I do also want to reiterate that these sprays very often contain PFAS 3/4 of the time. I personally, I'm a bug expert. I'm not a human health expert, but I listen to the folks who are human health experts. And it is common knowledge at this point that PFAS are linked to really serious risks for people like cancer, like endocrine disruption. Unfortunately, these sprays often do cross property lines, again, 3/4 of the time. And there are potentially ways to mitigate this. So, for example, by moving your pollinator habitat somewhere else or installing bushes to try to block that drift. But this represents a cost to people, right? It digs into people's limited time and resources for something that they didn't even want. So it poses a risk to pollinators in their yard. It exposes them and their pets to these chemicals that they did not consent to having in their yard. I'll also touch on a few other unknown risks to people and pollinators that I didn't cover. So one of them is essential oil sprays. I've noticed these are becoming a lot more popular. Even some of the bigger companies are starting to advertise that we use essential oils. But honestly, essential oil pesticides are not researched or regulated in the same way as other pesticides. And so we know even less about them than we do about the synthetic pesticides. But what we do know from limited research is that they can also harm or repel pollinators. So they're not completely safe. And anecdotally, I have also heard from some of our members about people who signed up for those essential oil sprays, but their property was sprayed with the same synthetic product that we've been talking about today. So just be careful. One other unknown risk is that we looked at the risk from one single exposure in this study, but we know that that is not realistic. We know that these sprays are often scheduled every 2 or every 3 weeks, which really increases the risk. We also know that synergists were added or chemicals that increase the toxicity. And the effect of those synergists is not something that we've factored in to those calculations. So of course, the risk is going to be even higher. And finally, as the bug people, we did not look directly at impacts on humans and pets, but these are certainly incredibly important. Something that we don't, know enough about and need to keep looking into. But I think that assuming the risk is zero, especially when we're talking about PFAS, is just not the correct assumption here. So now for some good news. So you don't have to spray your yard to keep yourself and your family safe. Not only is there another way, but there are even better ways. So better ways for you, better ways for ecosystems, and ways that are actually more effective at keeping mosquitoes at bay. And despite the advertising that these companies have, there is no evidence that their sprays protect against disease. So, to talk about alternatives, I am now going to pass it off to the toxic-free team.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. That was incredibly informative. And please bear with me for a moment while I share my slides. All right. Is that working?
Yes.
Okay, great. Great. So now that we have learned more about mosquitoes and the impact of spraying, we are going to talk about strategies and hopefully some solutions. And there we go. Sorry. Here we go. So we're going to start the conversation about mosquito solutions and prevention strategies with a quick dive into integrated pest management, or IPM. And I imagine there are a lot of organic gardeners on here who may have heard of IPM. And we'll just spend a little time today talking about how this is a framework that can be used to address not only mosquitoes, but also other pests like rodents or roaches. IPM is a comprehensive approach to pest management, and it aims to reduce the use of synthetic chemicals by providing a decision-making process to determine if, when, and where pest suppression is needed and what methods are appropriate. IPM can be used in indoor settings as well as outside. So on this slide, you'll see that IPM is a pyramid, just like the old food pyramid, with the largest principle as the foundation of the pyramid, prevention. And that's where we always want to start the conversation about pest management. If we have solid prevention practices, often the other steps of the pyramid are going to be unnecessary or minimal. So the base of the pyramid is prevention. That's taking steps to keep pests out before they ever show up. The second tier is cultural or sanitation. So this is establishing routines that are going to reduce pest presence, such as regular cleaning and sanitation. For example, around your home, removal of debris after a storm, around drains and gutters. And then the third tier is physical, things like screening windows, blocking pests like mice out of your home by filling holes, using traps, or caulking around sinks and drains. Then the fourth tier is biological. This can be using natural enemies of pests, such as other bugs or birds and plants that repel pests to keep their populations low and away from the home. And then finally at the top, we have chemical. So in an IPM system, this is going to be the very last choice and only used when all of the other methods have been implemented and the problem persists or under some emergency circumstances. But in an IPM system, chemical use is the last resort. And it's not always an effective solution, and it can have unintended consequences for our health or to non-target species. So what does IPM look like when we're talking about mosquitoes? The foundation is prevention. The absolutely most effective way to prevent mosquitoes is to eliminate their breeding grounds. So that's going to be stagnant or standing water. As Jacqueline mentioned earlier, mosquitoes can breed in water as small as a bottle cap. So we want to be tenacious, thorough, and vigilant detectives in finding and removing standing water around the home. Here's a checklist to start. Have you checked buckets, old tires, roof gutters, stormwater drains, bird baths, kids' toys? We've had a drought, as many of you know, in Durham this year, and one small upside of that is that the mosquito season hasn't been as intense as usual yet. But the forecast in Durham has rain arriving this evening and all day tomorrow. So this week will be a great time to put what you're learning tonight into practice and also to share it with your neighbors. A lot of these are reminders. They're things that you already know, but you might need to think about twice and just remember to do again and again. So this week, after it rains, we're going to walk around our homes and look for even tiny amounts of standing water. You're going to discard old tires in approved disposal sites, or store them inside. Look for wheelbarrows, carts, canoes, anything like that around the home. Store it upside down. And then this is one that I think gets forgotten, but is very important. Emptying children's toys and checking sandboxes that may collect water. I have a 4-year-old and I'm constantly finding toys left outside, and many of them collect water. In fact, this photo on the right in the corner is actually a disc golf basket in our yard when I did our mosquito walk around. And I realized that all of these shallow discs can collect rainwater and they become the perfect breeding sites for mosquitoes. So keep in mind, tip it, toss it, stop it. Another biological mosquito management strategy we field a lot of questions about is the deployment of a bacteria called BTI. And BTI granules or dunks can be submerged in standing water and ingested by the feeding larvae, and it kills them and prevents the larvae from becoming biting adults. Mosquito dunks, like those pictured here, are considered organic. They're widely available in garden and home stores and are effective for 30 days. The dunks are considered safer for bird baths, rain barrels, ditches, tree holes, roof gutters, etc. Basically anywhere that water collects. This week, if you follow, I think Homegrown National Park, we've seen Doug Tallamy promoting these in what are called buckets of doom. And that's where a quarter of a chunk of the dunk is left in a bucket of water along with some leaves or grass clippings, and it creates an inviting habitat for the mosquito to lay eggs, and then the water needs to be switched out every 30 days. And that's a really important point because if the water isn't switched out regularly or maintained, these buckets actually become more breeding ground that increases the mosquito population around your home. Do they work? We have actually, we've heard mixed reviews about their efficacy. And so I think it's safe to say that they can be a useful tool in the toolbox. And we would love to hear from you if you found them to be effective. I also think it's important to say at the same time that they're not a catch-all solution. And like introducing any biological disruption, they may have unintended consequences for the ecosystem if you were to try to use them in something like a pond. So we encourage care where they're used around the home. And we'd love to hear if you have had success stories about these or any of the other tactics we've mentioned. As Jacqueline shared earlier, mosquitoes are part of the natural ecosystem. And when we have too many, often it's because of the lack of natural predators in our urban habitats. And one way we can prevent mosquitoes is by creating a welcome habitat for dragonflies, bats, birds, and other natural predators of mosquitoes. So you can consider installing bat boxes, or if you have water, around your home, introducing dragonfly larvae to feed on the mosquitoes around your home. You can also plant native plants that these natural predators feed on. At the neighborhood level, we all know of at least 1 or 2 spots around town where water collects after a storm. But many folks don't know that there is a Adopt a Drain program in Durham. You can go to draindurham.org, and we'll share this link after the meeting. And residents can sign up to adopt a neighborhood drain to ensure that it stays clear of debris and stays flowing, which can reduce the opportunity for mosquito breeding. So partner with a neighbor and adopt a drain near you. There are no 100% effective solutions to address all mosquitoes. And as Jacqueline has pointed out, maybe there shouldn't be. So they do play an important role in the ecosystem as well. So we need to have some strategies to reduce bites and to repel mosquitoes so that we can also enjoy the outdoors in the summer months. What are some things we can do? If feasible, you can use a box fan when you're outside. Mosquitoes are weak flyers and they can be blown away. Wear light pants and long sleeves in summer evenings. Use repellent. There are a number of repellent options at Toxic Free NC. We encourage people to apply these on clothes and not onto skin. If you want to avoid synthetic chemicals, oil of lemon eucalyptus has been found to be just as effective as DEET in repelling mosquitoes. And it's the active ingredient in many Murphy's Naturals products. We love Murphy's Naturals. They're a North Carolina-based company. They're a certified B Corp, which means they have a commitment to sustainability. But even essential oils like oil of lemon eucalyptus, they can have respiratory impacts. So please use caution with them, with any sprays, especially around children. And we'd love to hear in the chat if you have other effective strategies you use to fight the bite. As Jacqueline mentioned earlier, mosquito prevention must be a community effort, and everyone on this call can help. Right now, before it gets too hot and too wet, is a really important time of year to remind neighbors about mosquito prevention. After this webinar, we'll share a toolkit of flyers and images that you can share on social media or in newsletters or around your neighborhood to start the conversation. We also have spray-free zone signs you can see in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. And we'll share a link later if you want to order a sign for your yard, like the one pictured. I also wanted to shout out Sarah Go, who was a graduate student working with us this past semester. She's in the Duke Nicholas School, and she created many of the materials and images you've been seeing on these slides. So please let us know how these work and if they spark valuable conversation with your neighbors and how we can be of support. And with that, we've concluded our slides. We welcome your questions, your insights, or your stories. We'd love to hear what strategies you've tried and if anything you've heard tonight has inspired you to take action in your community.
We had one come in already about, can you change the water, or instead of changing the water, can you just add more dunk? Do we know the answer to that?
I do not know the answer to that.
I took a look at the label instructions for the dunks, and there's nothing that forbids you from doing that. So I would say go for it if that's your preference. I have never used dunks, so I can't personally speak to effectiveness. And if one of those, either dumping water and starting from scratch or just adding another dunk which one is going to be more effective. But I would say, yeah, try a little bit of both and see what works better for you because there's nothing on the label that says do this or don't do that.
I just want to note this, Barbara Driscoll. Doug Ptolemy told me that the dunks were typically good for about 30 days. So after 30 days, you can add another one. It will have dissipated.
We have another question here from Erica. How do we know if an essential oil bug or mosquito service is okay to use? And then at the bottom, we're also going to try the buckets of doom.
That one's really tricky. I think the short answer is that we can't know for sure because the essential oils are so understudied as far as their effects. So, and I do want to differentiate. Alexis was talking about using an essential oil on your skin, sort of as a personal protection. That's okay. I'm talking about the ones, and I think you are too, Erica, about the ones that you're spraying into your yard. So certain essential oils are going to have repellent qualities for pollinators. So they might not outright kill them, but they're still going to keep them away from your yard because they don't like the spray either. But as I mentioned, I've heard from multiple people that especially the bigger companies that offer the pyrethroid services in addition to the essential oil services, even if you sign up for the essential oil service and you think that's what you're getting, you might just be getting the pyrethroid. So I just caution of be careful. Um, and yeah, we don't always know the effects of the essential oils. And even for the ones we do, it can be really tricky to know whether that company is doing right by you. So that's my caution.
I see a note from Camille who says, I'm highly allergic to mosquito bites and often have a severe reaction. I use all of these strategies at once, and I'm often swarmed just stepping outside. So wish me luck in my first summer going pesticide free. And I would encourage you, Camille, often this is where reaching out to neighbors is also an important part of the equation. And you may have done that, but it can be so hard if you have all the right practices in place and you're working on standing water in your yard, but maybe there's something in your neighbor's yard that isn't. And so yeah, just encourage you to, have those conversations and really make it a community effort to the extent you can. And we have a toolkit we're going to share afterwards with a lot of um, different flyers about different pieces of this information to help people understand how those steps can make a difference. See, we're getting a lot in the chat here. Donna asks, how many buckets of doom would you need on your property to effectively control mosquito populations? And I do not have an answer to that. If anyone here has tried them, I'm interested in, always wanting to learn more about what's working for people. So if anyone has tried it and can offer advice, we'd welcome you to share.
I guess I would also add in some of the resources we will share, like we talked a little bit about, it's impossible to eliminate all mosquitoes. So these are all strategies to try to make it nice to be outside. But yeah, just like it's hard to eliminate all mosquitoes in your yard, and it's probably not the goal that we should have. But yeah, I don't know about the number of dunks, but just wanted to add that.
I'm seeing something from Sandy about truck spraying every night until November. Sandy, where do you live? What part of the state? I see, referring to Beaufort. And we do see a lot more spraying in the coastal areas. And have had some really um, a lot of conversations this year after the spring that happened in Durham, and hopefully are ensuring that Durham takes some steps this year so that we don't have to do as much spraying as has happened in the coastal areas. I do know in many of those areas there are some possibilities to opt out of municipal spraying on the county websites. I know that's the case in Dare County, so I would encourage you to see if you can um, add your name and your address to a list to be avoided on their route. Maggie asks, what are the dunks made of? What are the ingredients that are considered organic? My understanding is the dunks are granules of BT, which is a bacteria. Um, I don't know if someone can speak to it in more detail. In terms of, I don't live in, sorry, trying to follow the chats and speak to them.
Yeah, and it uses a strain of BT that is very specific to mosquitoes and their close relatives. So that's why it's not going to harm things like bees, like aquatic beetles, like dragonfly larvae that live in the water. But it does harm, again, those closely related species of flies that aren't biters. And so that's why we caution, use it in the bucket of doom, but don't toss it in a natural body of water because it might throw off those other flies that we don't necessarily want to kill. But BTI is pretty safe. As far as the other ingredients, so whenever you look at a pesticide label, you'll see the active ingredient and then, other ingredients, whatever percentage it is. We don't know those other ingredients. They're not necessarily public information. And so that's why I tell people when you do dump out your bucket of doom, maybe don't dump it on a plant that you're really fond of or somewhere that the dog is going to get into and drink, just because we don't necessarily know what those other ingredients are. That's not to say that they are unsafe. I just don't know what they are and can't say for certain that they're good for your pet to drink. So,
I'm seeing a question from Anne in the chat. How can we avoid the nightly spraying? I'm in 27705. Anne, I believe you're speaking about what happened last fall. Durham did spraying twice of an insecticide called Ramoa Tri, and that was to address presence of West Nile virus in Durham. And we've had a number of conversations over the past few months with Durham County Public Health to hopefully avoid that situation again altogether this year. And I think the best way that we can do it is by reducing the mosquito population before it gets to the point um, where there's a higher presence of mosquitoes. And so we've had some really encouraging conversations with Durham Public Health. I think they're committed this year. They've been doing a lot of canvassing in various neighborhoods to make sure people are aware of prevention strategies. They're also writing letters to tire sales um, businesses, trying to make sure that tires at local businesses are not collecting water. And they've been pretty amenable in terms of working with the community to come up with a more transparent process about what it would look like in the future if they do decide to move forward with spraying. When I spoke earlier about that opt-out option that some counties have, that's usually because the counties are spraying for mosquitoes as a nuisance and not necessarily as a public health threat. And so when it gets to the point where there's a public health threat from a specific disease, they're more reluctant to offer opting out options because that would reduce the efficacy of the effort to spray. I personally hope that they do not spray again anywhere in Durham, and when they do, we've really been encouraging the county to adopt a longer notification period of at least 72 hours so that people can adequately prepare and be aware if it does happen. But it is our strong hope that, and part of this effort is really to do everything that we can to prevent mosquitoes from getting as bad as they usually get. And that's where we're trying to enlist everyone's help. I know we are almost at time. Um, so if you do have further questions, please, we would welcome you to email them. Please reach out. If other questions come up, if you find resources that are effective that you want to share, we'd really love to hear how it goes as people are attempting these buckets of doom or anything else. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for their time in coming tonight. Thank you especially to Angie and Murtado, our interpreters, to Jacqueline for sharing your expertise. It's been incredibly informative. And, we are so grateful to Xerces and to New Hope Bird Alliance for partnering on this webinar. Toxic Free NC, New Hope Bird Alliance, and Xerces, we are all nonprofits, and we are able to keep running thanks to supporters like you. So if it was helpful to you, please consider supporting our organizations, and definitely make sure to sign up for our newsletters and make sure you can stay informed. And we will be following up with some links about what we talked about tonight and more information. So we look forward to staying in touch, and we thank you for your time this evening.